To the casual observer, Monday, November 23, 1981, began as nothing more than a masterclass in British monotony. Across the rolling hills of the north and the industrialised skylines of the Midlands, the morning air was thick with a leaden, suffocating grey. Millions of people performed their sacred morning rituals, flicking on electric kettles, grumbling about the damp cold, and preparing for another unremarkable commute under a slate-coloured sky. It felt like just another November day in Britain, but high above the troposphere, the laws of physics were preparing a violent demonstration. A catastrophic celestial engine was shifting gears, and the British Isles were directly in its path. While the nation watched the drizzle, meteorologists were watching something far more sinister: a bomb. In the lexicon of weather science, this refers to explosive cyclogenesis, a phenomenon where atmospheric pressure drops so rapidly it mimics the shock waves of an explosion. On Sunday, the barometer sat at a relatively stable 994 millibars. By midday Monday, it had cratered to a staggering 968. This wasn't just a change in weather, it was a total collapse of the local atmosphere. This bomb was fueled by a high-stakes collision of two elemental titans. From the frozen, jagged reaches of the Arctic, a massive injection of polar air was screaming southward. Simultaneously, a plume of unseasonably warm, moisture-heavy air was being sucked up from the Mediterranean. When these two air masses slammed into each other over the UK, they didn't just merge, they fought. The stage was set for a 300-mile-long front of spinning fury. Despite the brewing chaos, as the British public remained blissfully unaware, in the British psyche, tornadoes were an exotic American nightmare, something reserved for the flat plains of Kansas or the Wizard of Oz. We had gales, we had rain, we had fog, but we didn't have twisters. Or so we thought. By mid-morning, as the rain turned from a light spray to a heavy, rhythmic beating, the first black umbilical cord of a funnel cloud began to descend from the clouds over Anglesey. The fuse had been lit. The largest tornado outbreak in European history was no longer a theoretical threat. It was hitting the ground. The first casualty of this atmospheric war was Anglesey, a rugged island sentinel off the coast of North Wales. By 10 a.m., the atmosphere here had become thick, charged with a strange electricity that made the skin crawl. At RAF Valley, the meteorological officers weren't just watching the rain, they were watching a catastrophe calibrate itself. Lightning had been flickering on the horizon since 5 a.m., a premature warning that the sky was losing its grip. At precisely 10:19 a.m., the abstraction of unsettled weather became a terrifying physical reality. A colossal, bruised cloud, stretching over a mile long, drifted over the seaside town of Holyhead. It didn't just pass, it transformed. Sergeant 1 of the Marine Craft Unit was standing near Porthy Failing House when he witnessed the impossible. The base of the cloud began to deform, detwisting into a sinister, jagged hook. Within seconds, this hook didn't just drop, it punched downward. A mushroom-shaped crown erupted at the top of the funnel, and a swirling column of water vapour, debris, and raw kinetic energy slammed into the ground. This was an F2 tornado, a force of nature capable of generating winds up to 150 miles per hour. It was a spinning ghost of grey and black, tearing through the harbour with a sound described as 1,000 freight trains screaming in unison. The tornado's path was a surgical strike of destruction. It moved from Holyhead County School directly toward the railway station. At the school, time slowed down for hundreds of children. A massive section of the roof was simply erased, torn away like wet cardboard. Wooden beams, bricks, and heavy slates were transformed into supersonic shrapnel, flying across the yard where, just 5 minutes later, the children would have been playing. They watched from behind trembling glass as their sanctuary was dismantled above them. In the town centre, on the station street, the physics of the storm left witnesses in shock. The windows of the terraced houses didn't break inward from the wind, they exploded outward. The tornado's core had created such a violent vacuum that it literally sucked the air out of the buildings, pulling the glass into the street. 20 properties were gutted in seconds. As the first funnel collapsed, a second, even larger one formed, continuing the assault for another 10 terrifying seconds. Holyhead was in ruins, and the monster was just beginning its meal. As the clock struck noon, the atmospheric bomb didn't just explode. No bat jiao di chuyen, voi mot tok jo son moa tan han. The weather front was now a 300-mile wall of kinetic energy, racing southeast at over 30 miles per hour. This wasn't a localized storm anymore. It was a nationwide blitz. By midday, the industrial heart of England, Manchester, found itself in the crosshairs. Within a matter of minutes, 4 separate tornadoes touched down across Greater Manchester. From the suburbs of St. Helens to the narrow streets of Warrington, the sky seemed to be breathing funnels of black dust and debris. But while Manchester was being battered by multiple strikes, the most terrifying anomaly of the day was manifesting in the quiet county of Shropshire. Near the tiny village of Norbury, the atmosphere gave birth to a giant. This wasn't a hit-and-run funnel. It was a long-track predator. This tornado touched down and refused to let go of the earth. It carved a jagged northeast path through the rolling Shropshire countryside with a relentless tenacity. For a staggering 37 miles, this spinning column of violence stayed on the ground. To put that in perspective, that is a distance longer than the span from London to Brighton. It was a marathon of destruction that tore through fields, flattened ancient hedgerows, and snapped century-old oaks like they were mere toothpicks. As this 37-mile monster approached the market town of Whitchurch, the sound was described as a low, guttural roar that vibrated in the very bones of the residents. It didn't just damage property, it rearranged the landscape. Roofs were systematically peeled away, and farm outbuildings were reduced to splinters in seconds. By the time it finally lifted and vanished back into the bruised clouds, it had set a record that still haunts British meteorological history. But the front wasn't satisfied. Even as Shropshire reeled, the storm was already rearming itself for an assault on one of Britain's most populated urban centres, Birmingham. The second largest city in the UK was about to find out that no concrete jungle could withstand the raw physics of a 1,000-ton vacuum. By 2 p.m., the atmospheric assault had reached its terrifying zenith. The storm front was no longer just a weather event, it had become a production line of funnels. As the system swept into the West Midlands and toward East Anglia, the sheer density of the strikes defied belief. In the historic village of Stoneleigh, Warwickshire, the physics of the day chose a particularly vulnerable target: a static caravan park. These weren't flimsy holiday trailers, they were year-round homes, heavy and anchored. But to the OF2 tornado that dropped from the black sky, they were nothing more than plastic toys. Witnesses described a sound like a low-flying jet engine as the vortex tore through the park. In a matter of seconds, 20 massive caravans were snatched from their foundations. Some were flipped like coins, as landing on their roofs with sickening crunches. Others were simply pulverized, their metal skins peeled back to reveal the intimate interiors of people's lives before being scattered across the mud. Families huddled inside felt the terrifying sensation of their entire world losing gravity. One moment they were watching the rain, the next they were airborne, trapped inside a spinning metallic box. It was a miracle of physics that the twisted wreckage didn't become a mass grave. But the true peak of this madness occurred as the front slammed into East Anglia. Between 1 p.m. and 4 p.m., the counties of Norfolk, Suffolk, and Cambridgeshire became the most dangerous places in Europe. In this 3-hour window, a staggering 43 tornadoes were confirmed. That is nearly one tornado every 4 minutes. The landscape of the East was a chaotic tapestry of white-knuckled farmers watching from barns as spinning columns of soil and hay danced across their fields. Trees were snapped like matchsticks, and ancient flint walls that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. This wasn't a single storm anymore. It was a synchronized aerial bombardment. The front was pushing southeast at a relentless 30 miles per hour, leaving a trail of shattered glass and broken timber that stretched across the entire width of the country. Britain was no longer a green and pleasant land. It was a debris field. By 4 p.m., as the final funnel cloud dissipated over the Essex coastline, a heavy, unnatural silence descended upon Britain. The atmospheric bomb had spent its fury, leaving behind a 300-mile scar of shattered timber and twisted metal. In the beginning, the nation was blind to the scale of the catastrophe. In Holyhead, residents thought they had been the victims of a freak, isolated storm. In Manchester, they believed it was a local anomaly. But as the evening news began to broadcast, the true magnitude started to bleed into the public consciousness. This wasn't a series of accidents. It was a synchronized national disaster. The Tornado and Storm Research Organization, TORO, immediately launched an unprecedented scientific investigation. They appealed to the public through television and newspapers, as asking for any scrap of evidence, photographs, eyewitness accounts, or barometric readings. The response was a flood of data that overwhelmed the researchers. When the final tally was confirmed, the scientific community sat in stunned silence. 104 tornadoes. In just 5 hours and 26 minutes, the UK had experienced more tornadoes than it typically sees in 3 entire years. To find a comparable event, one would have to look at the violent tornado alleys of the American Midwest, not the temperate islands of Britain. Yet amid the millions of pounds in property damage and the ruins of hundreds of homes, one statistic stood out above all others, defying the laws of probability. 0. Not a single person had been killed. 8 people were injured, mostly by flying glass, but the death toll remained at 0. Hence, it was the invisible miracle of 1981. This was partly due to timing. The tornadoes were fast-moving and relatively short-lived, and partly due to sheer blind luck. If the Holyhead tornado had struck just 5 minutes later during the school break, the story of 1981 would be one of national mourning rather than meteorological curiosity. The 1981 outbreak fundamentally altered the British relationship with the sky. It shattered the myth that the UK was safe from the twister. Scientists now know that per square mile, the United Kingdom actually experiences more tornadoes than the United States. They may be smaller and less frequent than the giants of Kansas, but on that cold Monday in November, the atmosphere proved that it could bring a superpower to its knees. And yet for those who stood on their doorsteps and watched their chimneys tumble into the street, November 23rd remains the day the sky fell down, and the day Britain learned to never take a grey morning for granted again.